Introduce your next speaker. This is Brian Swenson. He's a close personal friend of mine, former coworker at the Leadership Institute, but he decided that he missed Florida, and so he left LI about a decade ago, went down, started working in the campaign world. Rick Scott is a senator now because of Brian Swenson, we like to say, because he worked on his governor's race, and he's been in Scott world for a very long time. Brian has branched out on his own, and he now has his own consulting company working on campaigns and issue-based advocacy all around the country. And he's going to be talking to you about identifying, targeting, and turning out the early vote. He has done it. You're going to learn from an expert on this and someone who has done it successfully. So please, Brian, take it away.
Thank you very much, Patty. Very excited to be here. Thank you very much, Patty, for the introduction. I want to walk everybody through today how to turn out the early vote. In the state of Florida, I would say Florida leads the nation in how early voting is done. We've been at the forefront of it for many, many years, and the rest of the nation continues to catch up with some of the different tactics and things that we do use in Florida. Roughly about at least half of the state, by the time you get to Election Day, roughly half the state has already voted. In some instances, upwards of 55 to 60% of the state has voted come Election Day. So those votes that are banked, those are the difference makers when it's time for Election Day. We still do have, we still do surge on Election Day. Election Day generally is when a lot of the Republicans come out. Historically, Republicans in Florida have excelled at absentee ballot or vote by mail ballot. That's where the Republicans historically have done well. The Democrats have caught up to that game. The Democrats historically have been very good at early voting, and the Republicans have been catching up to that game. So typically the Democrats do have a slight advantage going into Election Day, but we do turn out the vote, and because of strong turnout for Republicans, that's where we're able to win come Election Day. And Florida has a very close history of close races, which we'll touch on. So before we start talking about early voting and absentee ballot and some of the tactics behind those, I want to just touch on a couple things first. I'm going to walk you guys through a couple of important things: knowing your election calendar, establishing a campaign budget, knowing your message, acquiring voter information, trends, and a database, developing a voter contact program. And I want to note to everybody, a very, very strong voter contact program is going to be the difference maker between winning and losing. It really is. If you're a local race, a voter contact program, and what I mean by a voter contact program is going to be your door-to-door, your phone banking, your volunteer text messaging, all those different things. That's what a voter contact program is. Sign waving is not a voter contact program. You're going to most likely hear me be very negative about sign waving. I have fought over the years with volunteers about sign waving and how it is completely irrelevant to winning elections. And apologies to you if you really love sign waving in this room. I'm going to be very candid and very blunt. It is not effective. It is a waste of time. Only time you use sign wave is at 6:30 in the morning on Election Day, when you catch rush hour traffic, because you can't talk to voters on their doorstep at 6:30 in the morning. So you can sign wave from 6:30 to 8:30 a.m. for rush hour traffic if you really want to sign wave. Anyway, so a strong voter contact program is a difference maker in close races. A voter contact program will help to turn out an additional 1% to 2 percentage points on a statewide race. On a local race, it will make a difference up to, I'd say, about 4, 5, 6%. So that's where a very good voter contact program will make the difference, is on those smaller, more local races. Here's just an overview of Florida's close election history and why we always stress out and freak out about a strong voter contact program, the early voting, the absentee ballot chasing. As you all know, in 2000, George Bush won the state by 541 votes. 2010, Rick Scott won the state by 1.2 percentage points. That was our voter contact program. Rick Scott won in 2014 by 1.1 percentage points. That was the voter contact program that they put together. In 2018, Rick Scott won by 10,000 votes. That was the voter contact program that was put together by his team, by the DeSantis team. You can see right there, Ron DeSantis won by 32,000 votes, 0.4%. That is absolutely nothing. 32,000 votes out of the millions of votes that were cast in the state of Florida is nothing. So that just shows you guys how important a voter contact program is, how you need to chase every single ballot and treat it like it is a win or loss. I was involved in another race, with the shenanigans of Broward and Palm Beach. I'm sure everyone saw a little bit of that this cycle. I'll touch on the recount stuff in a little bit, but another one of the races, the Commissioner of Agriculture race, which I was very involved in, we did everything right, but come election day, we were up 50,000 votes after Broward and Palm Beach found more ballots and did what they do. We ended up losing that one by 6,000 votes. So it just shows you how important the voter contact program is, how important turning out every single vote is, and how important it is to also have a recount team and effective election day operation, which I will also touch on. So here's just some basics for y'all on knowing your calendar and knowing the election rules. It's important to put together a calendar to know when absentee ballots are going to be mailed, when early voting starts. Some counties have different rules. So you got to figure out, if you're doing a statewide contest, you got to figure out what counties are going to be operating their early voting hours, when and where. So that's something that you're going to have to figure out and do some research on. You're also going to need to know what the rules are. So if you're sending someone a mail piece that is encouraging them to sign up for an absentee ballot, you're going to need to know what the state laws say for what you're able to put in that mail piece. Because some states will have different rules that say you can't send a mail piece that has people sign up and request an absentee ballot. You must use a state form for doing that. So that's just something you're going to have to figure out. And you're going to want to build your voter contact program around a lot of these key dates. You're going to want to build a campaign budget. A good rule to kind of live by is you want to break out your campaign budget by 70%, 20%, and 10%. 10%, and I'll explain that a little bit better, but it really depends on the race, and this rule does not always hold up. But generally, the way you want to build out your budget is your consulting costs and staffing costs should be about 10 to 20% of your budget. Direct mail should be about 20 to 40%, and then your television and digital. And I merge those together. I'm a bigger advocate of putting more money on digital than I am on TV. I believe that digital is more effective and at reaching people, especially if you have a very, very limited budget. If you have a very big budget with millions and millions of dollars in the state of Florida, go up on TV. But if you don't have that, go all in on digital. That was something I did on my agriculture race. We ended up being outspent by our opponents 3-1 in the primary. But I went all in on digital, all in on mail and text messaging, and we were able to sneak by them despite being down in the polls by 8 percentage points. And it's because we utilized digital and direct mail. Everyone was not doing direct mail. And so that was, we tailored our program based around what we thought our opponents were doing, and they went all in and bought all TV, and that was really what they were doing. So you want to have a well-balanced campaign budget and a well-balanced voter contact program, which I will touch on. It's important to have a message, a central message for your campaign. You need to have that developed, and you want to incorporate that into your voter contact program. So when you put together a script for phone banking, you're going to want to tailor in some of those message points. You're going to want to use wedge issues to spike turnout. Things that catch people's attention. If you're doing a text message, you're going to want to incorporate some of your messaging. An example of something that we did was there was high crime in Tallahassee, and we put together a text message attacking Andrew Gillum and touching upon the high crime rates and the lawlessness that existed while he was mayor, and that was one of the message points that were utilized by the Ron DeSantis campaign in this last election cycle in Florida. So it's important to develop your message and incorporate that into your voter contact program. Moving on to the voter contact program, what it is, there's one element which is going to be your mail, TV, digital, paid phones. The other element is going to be your field program, that is your volunteer-based voter contact program, and that's going to be door-to-door phone banking, texting. Having a dedicated field program isn't easy, but it really does make a difference. I'm a big advocate of a field program. It's always good to have a healthy program. And like I said earlier, it's going to turn out your vote statewide anywhere from 1 to 2 percentage points higher. And then on local races, anywhere from 1 to 5 percentage points higher. And I could go all day and talk to you all about building an effective field program, but that's not what this presentation is. It is important, and I'm sure people have lots of questions about putting together a solid field operation, but that's not what I'll be able to go into today. But if you want to talk after, I'm more than happy to share my thoughts there. Everyone should have a handout. I wanted to give you guys a sample of what a voter contact schedule looks like. I took my calendar that we put together for the Commissioner of Agriculture race in Florida. That's what we utilized in the primary. It's not typically what most statewide campaigns would look like. They're going to do a little bit more TV than what we did. But again, that was what our strategy was. Nothing is exact science. You kind of got to sometimes go with what your gut is or what your opponents are doing. But I did want you all to at least have an opportunity to see what a voter contact calendar does look like. So I encourage you guys to build, if you're going to build something like that, build it something similar, but don't copy and paste every single thing that I did. It is really just, it's an example for you all. But what I did in there, so you'll see the yellow highlighted text, that is the official election dates by the state. So you can kind of see how I tailored some of my mail pieces around when ballots are mailed or when early voting started. You can see the green text, that's my TV and digital buys. Red text are the direct mail drop dates, and that's what that means is that's when I put the mail in the actual mailboxes to be sent out. So that's what that means. It doesn't mean that it hits their mailbox that day. Typically, mail will hit 3 days after, 2 to 3 days after you drop it off. And you want to make sure you know where the central post office locations are so you can get your mail dropped directly there instead of at the local one. You want to go to the central hub where all the mail is delivered so that you can ensure that it's delivered timely, because you lose a day if you drop it off to the local place. Sometimes mail vendors do that. Sometimes they get lazy. So just always be cognizant of that and know that your mail is getting dropped at a central location. I've had to drive mail overnight across the state of Florida to make sure that it gets delivered on time. So mail is so darn important, and making sure that your mail hits at the right exact time. I'll give you guys an example. I had to do one local race, and it was the most mind-boggling race I've had to deal with, because I had to deal with family, a whole quartet of family members that were making campaign decisions, and I couldn't do what the consultant likes to do, which is win. And they did not want me to attack an opponent, and they wanted to wait until they were attacked to attack our opponent. And our opponent was a guy that used the police force to spy on his political opponents. It's total banana republic stuff that this guy was doing. He was arrested for domestic abuse. He shot a gun in the wall at his ex-wife. He was under FBI investigation. So this dude should not have won. But because the family did not want me to attack, I had to wait until I was attacked. And then by the time the mail was delivered that was already printed, 3 days later, they hit us with another attack. So we were already on our back, being attacked, and it's hard to come back from that. So that gives you guys, something else to consider is know when you might potentially be attacked. They perfectly dropped their attacks on us the day the direct mail was being delivered. And by the time we were able to get it going, 3 days later, it was too late. So that's just something that everyone needs to consider too, is when you might potentially get hit, and you want to time your hits as well on your opponents if you're going negative. The purple text, those are text messaging. Text messaging is a new thing that everyone's starting to utilize. The only thing I'm going to really dive into on the text messaging as far as my advice goes, I'm an advocate for it. I was using it in Florida in 2016 for voter turnout and volunteer turnout, and I quadrupled my phone bank shifts overnight by doing text messaging. I had volunteer lists, and I just texted those to help with increasing my volunteer activity. But for the voter turnout part, I actually did text messaging, and I did A/B testing on it. I had my control group that didn't get a message, and then I had my test group. And I ended up turning out, and I focused on low and mid propensity voters. And what I did was I did a text message saying something along the lines of how Crooked Hillary is surging at the polls. Her people are turning out. We need you to go vote. This is the closest early voting location to your home. And what I did was I pulled homes within a mile radius of early voting locations, and I sent a text message to them. And we ended up doing an analysis later, and we turned out for low and mid propensity voters, I think it was like 3 percentage points, that group that we did the text message to actually turned out that day, higher than the group that we did not text. So I'm an advocate for it. I'm an advocate for doing engagement in the text messaging. I hate when I see vendors and people dropping one text message out and not actually replying to the person and engaging. So you want to treat text messaging to make it more effective. Instead of a spam message, you want to treat it like an engagement and personalize it. Include the person's name. If it's a wrong name, which you're going to get, that's good. You just say, hey, sorry, Sam, I apologize. What's your name? And I've actually had very, very positive engagements from doing that. Nothing's science, but I kind of just monitor what things are done and said and see what's effective from there. The blue text, those are your robocalls and ringless voicemails. Robos, those are kind of going the way of the dinosaur. People hate them, but I do think that they're still kind of effective in at least reminding people to vote. In the very least, you tell people, hey, the sooner you vote, the sooner you get taken off my robocall list, and that is a motivator for some people. So the next thing is you got to get a database. You got to acquire your voter data. It's very important to know your high propensity voters versus your mid and low propensity voters. Those are people that are more likely to vote versus not. It's important to know people's voting trends. You got to know who your absentee ballot or vote by mail ballot recipients. You got to know that, especially if you're going to be sending mail pieces to them. You can't. My recommendation is in that flyer I put together, the calendar. You might see that I broke up my mail pieces. I did my first mail piece. I dropped it right around the time of my to the absentee ballot recipients. I sent it to those folks right as the ballots were getting mailed. I saved that first mail piece for people that were not absentee ballot voters for 2 weeks later, or a week and a half later, to hit them right around the time that early voting started. So you got to break up your mail pieces and break up some of your messaging in different waves to target those folks. So that's why it's important to have a database and knowledge of voter trends. The state of Florida does a phenomenal job of tracking people's ability to vote and how they vote. It marks, if you're an absentee ballot recipient, your history of voting absentee. It tells you if they voted early. It tells you when they voted. And it also tells you if they voted on election day. So these are awesome things in the state of Florida that, because we're so organized and we have a very, very good voter database, we're able to track these things. Other states don't do that. Some states don't even do voter registration by party, which is crazy to me. But some states do it that way. So that's these are all little important things that you gotta have before we can start worrying about our voter contact program. Good, we have time. All right. So there are 2 ways that people can vote early in elections. There's early voting, and then there's absentee ballots. Or vote by mail ballots. It's different terminology. Florida, they just went from absentee ballots to now vote by mail because I guess people were offended that absentee insinuates that they're absent. I don't know. Ridiculous. People and their feelings, I don't know. Some states have different rules, and that's another thing that you got to know. Some states have different rules for absentee ballot voting. Some states require you to provide additional documentation of why you need to vote absentee. They actually want people that really have legitimate needs and reasons such as health or whatever, traveling. They want you to vote that way. And other states are easy. Florida, you just sign up and it gets in your mailbox. It's not that complicated. So that's why it's important to know your rules. With early voting, again, I know I mentioned this earlier, but it's so important to know your locations and know the hours. If you broadcast that early voting has started in a county because you're following what the state database, what the state tells you, and because in Florida you have optional early voting days and you have mandatory early voting days. So individual counties can decide when they want to, if they want to participate in the optional early voting. And generally, those are the more Democrat counties that take advantage of all of the early voting hours. And so it's important to know this because you don't want to put out a text message or a mail piece saying early voting in your county starts on this day when it's not, because that could potentially be an election violation if you're encouraging people to go vote when there's no voting happening. So that's why it's important to know all these details. Trust me. Trust me. That happened to us once where we did a door-to-door piece that had a precinct address and map. I mean, we were so specific to it. Most people don't do this, but they ended up changing one of the precinct locations in the last 24 hours of the election. And so we had it printed, and we started, dropping these off at people's doorsteps, and we almost got in trouble for that because it was providing people with a bad location. So I then had to run back through with a new address and, update the information. So that's why, again, it's important, and you could get an election violation if you're giving people inaccurate hours and locations where they can vote. Trust me, the Dems did it this last cycle, and we had a field day with that. So they actually, I think there's a criminal case that's about to be brought up because they took a doctored state form for absentee ballot voting, and they changed it. My theory on it was they changed it to say when absentee ballots can be returned. They changed it to say they could be returned up to 10 days after an election. And my theory on why they did that knowingly was to sue and go to the courts so that more ballots could be counted after election day was over. Military overseas are able to be counted up to 10 days after in Florida. Domestic absentee ballots are not, but they tried to get people to turn them in so that they could be counted. So that's my theory on why it was done. They claimed it was a low-level staffer making a mistake, but the Dems are smart, and that's something that they did this last cycle, and that's an election violation. And so it is going to be, I know they've lawyered up, and the Democratic Party of Florida is definitely going to be pursued on this one. So that's, again, why it's important to know your laws. So here are some good tactics that you all can use for direct mail. So the first thing you want to do is develop some vote by mail generation pieces. And what that means basically is for people that have a history. So in Florida, I think it's every 4 years, the absentee ballot list, you have to re-sign up. So you can sign up to receive an absentee ballot for up to 4 years, but when those 4 years pass, you have to sign up again. A lot of times seniors don't know that. So what we do is we monitor who fell off the absentee ballot list, the permanent absentee ballot list, that's what it's called, who fell off that, and we'll do an absentee ballot generation piece to them and remind them, hey, you need to re-sign up for your absentee ballot. So that's what an absentee ballot generation piece is. I also will do that to low and mid propensity voters. And when we, I don't know if anyone was here for the data presentation earlier, but I don't know what they touched upon, but data vendors are able to do their data science-y things and build me an algorithm that says, hey, this person could very well be a likely early absentee ballot voter. Let's target them. So I usually will do what the data people tell me and say, hey, this is smart. Let's go after these guys. So I'll do an absentee ballot generation piece to them as well. And it's standard campaign messaging, but it also includes the perforated thing that you can just rip off and fill out your absentee ballot and then mail it back in. That's how we do it in Florida. It just says something like, yes, I want to receive an absentee ballot. They write their name and they sign it, and that's it. Pretty easy. Florida's, again, friendly on this type of stuff. But to effectively also increase your likelihood of people either voting by mail or doing the absentee ballot generation piece, it's always helpful to follow up with a phone call from volunteers and do an additional touch there, and maybe even adding in a text message or something else. The more touches you have on people, around your mail pieces, around your TV. The more touches you have, the more effective you are in turning out those voters. So you always, I don't know if everyone's ever heard of like the 7-touch rule. You see me on TV, you see me in your mailbox, you see me on the, you see me on your door. If people get 7 impressions, they're more likely to remember you. And that's the case with Campaign World too. So you want to increase your likelihood that people will vote, and by doing that, you increase your touches. More phone calls, more robocalls, more mail pieces. So that's a little bit about the vote by mail generation piece. Yeah, well, that's more detailed. The seniors part I've touched upon. Yeah, I kind of just went through all this, but you all have that in your handout. The vote by mail chase piece, again, I just touched on this as well. It's the same concept for chasing absentee ballots as the mail generation pieces. You want to touch them as absentee ballots are dropping. I have actually segmented out and looked at my databases and looked at neighborhoods and precincts that have a higher amount of absentee ballot recipients, and I'll send people door to door chasing just those people. So that's something else that you could do. You want to treat every voter like they're the most relevant vote you could get, and it's that one vote that you're going to need to win. And in Florida, that's the case oftentimes. Is every vote matters. You can never take it for granted. All right, leading into early voting. You want to build your database. I've already touched on that. A lot of this stuff I've kind of touched upon. You all know I hate yard signs. I've touched upon sign waving, and I haven't gone too in depth on my hate on yard signs yet, but I do hate yard signs because everyone gets just absolutely, like, they're driven insane by having yard signs. If you don't have a yard sign for them, you're a terrible campaign, you're unprofessional, you don't know what you're doing. I've been told that so many times. And I actually purposely don't order yard signs just to piss people off, But for those people that you have that you don't want to, and this is one of my field, I have an entire slideshow on some volunteers you don't want going door to door. Some people, you want to put in a box and keep them far, far away from people. I call them the sign guy. So you want to have that person go put up your yard. This is something where I always get blown up from volunteers and activists. There's no yard signs at the early voting location. I'm like, oh, Jesus. All right, end of the world. So you have your sign guy go place yard signs at early voting locations. So when people see your name, they know to go vote for you because your sign's there. Forget the mail pieces, forget the voter contact program, it's the yard sign. Well, anyway, so yeah, get yard signs placed at early voting locations. That's something that you can have folks do. I mean, look, yard signs, I hate them, but for people with no name ID, they do help, especially on local races that no one knows what the hell they're voting for anyway, like your judges. A lot of times there's judges on the ballot in Florida. School board races, no one really knows who those folks are unless they run an actual good campaign. So yard signs, I guess, do help on that front. But for your larger statewide races, it's not the end of the world. I touched upon ranking my precincts that have higher volume of early voters and absentee ballot recipients. You want to touch those guys. I generally try to touch people 2 to 3 times on their doorstep. They see me 2 or 3 times throughout 2 months, the final 2 months of a campaign. Generally, that's what I try to do, and I will try to rank the areas I walk based around where my highest concentration of early voting folks and absentee ballot folks are. And I'll try to walk those areas first and then come loop back around a second time or third time by election day. Another awesome idea that is actually pretty effective is in doing early vote rallies outside of locations, early vote locations. I've done this very effectively before. In fact, I used it this last election cycle for Ron DeSantis. We organized some early vote rallies outside of locations. We picked a place right across the street and got a couple hundred people to come out, and then we pushed them to go across the street to go vote. And the most effective thing that we did was in the aftermath of Hurricane Michael. So Panhandle, the Panhandle was impacted pretty bad by Hurricane Michael. in Bay County, the voters turned out 10 percentage points less than what they historically do. And that is about 20,000 votes, Republican votes, that did not turn out. And so we were in a predicament of, holy cow, like, we need to turn these people out or we're gonna lose. And you all saw how close those races were. Rick Scott won by 10,000 votes. The operation that we put together in the Panhandle to turn out voters, I do believe is what is the difference maker for now Senator Scott on his campaign, and Ron DeSantis, because what we did was we used Rick Scott, Ron DeSantis, all the Republicans on the cabinet. We used them as a hook to try to draw people to come out and vote. And we found a location across the street from an early voting location, and we sent out massive text messages. We sent out, and it was hard because there was no mailboxes, so you couldn't do mail. People had relocated. People were not home. You didn't know where people were. People were at shelters. People were staying at their friends' homes. So we did a myriad of different things to try to drive people to turn out and vote. And we had a very, very successful event with this early vote barbecue. We had, I think it was about 2,000 people show up to this, and they all turned out and voted. And so this is where you get into the space of you got to nickel and dime votes. And that's the mentality that I always am in, is how do we nickel and dime? How do we get a couple extra votes here? How do we get a couple extra votes there? You know, we did a barbecue and had all of these statewide people show up, and that was a huge resource for us to turning folks out. And it was also carried on for the next couple of days. We saw an increase of turnout after that because people were talking about voting. You know, in the aftermath of the hurricane, no one was even thinking about voting. And there was that moment of, what the hell do we do to turn people out? You can't be overt and say, go turn out and vote. They just lost everything. And so we had to come up with some different tactics on identifying these people and figuring out how they're going to vote. And one of the things that I actually did was I utilized text messaging for this. What I did was I got a list of all the cell phone numbers in the hurricane impact zone of voters. The message was, hey, this is so-and-so with the Florida GOP. Just wanted to check in on you and your family to see how you're doing. Nothing about voting. Some people would respond. You know, it was generally positive. And so this is that voter engagement part that is so important. And from there, we went about 2 or 3 threads down in the text message before we even got to the conversation of voting. Some people would bring it up on their own, so we'd put them into a different bucket. Hey, great, thank you so much for checking in on me. Do you know when I can vote and how I can vote? And then that's when I'd directly go into it. We put together a website that had, it was Hurricane Michael, I forget the name of the website, but we created an entire website just as a resource for people. It had the best phone numbers for getting surveyors to come out and inspect your damage, insurance providers. It was all based and tailored around like recovery efforts. And then there was also a part where it said, and here is a list of updated early voting locations. And so it was relevant information. And we sent that link out to people as a resource to see how they could help recover. And in that resource, there was early voting location information. And that's how we tried to play it, where we were not being overt, but we were sensitive to folks and their needs, and we also used it to identify people that that had to relocate outside the region, and we then put them into the absentee ballot generation bucket. So we chased them, and I think we got an additional 1,000 people to sign up for absentee ballots that had relocated to different areas, and they turned out and voted. And we did this just via text messaging, and we identified about 500 people that were living in shelters. So I knew 500 people were living in shelters, all from text messaging. We identified this and moved them into the early vote barbecue bucket. So all these different things and data points that we were collecting, we actually utilized them, and it really helped with the turnout effort. So this is just one example of the different things that you can do with a voter contact program. We did phone banking. Phone banking, we also, the text messaging is, again, it's one example of the greater puzzle that the greater solutions that we put together in this puzzle of how the hell do we turn out voters in the Panhandle impact zone. And phone banking was utilized, and we chased people there. We had live dials from professional phone bank organizations. We did targeted digital to people on their cell phones. We did targeted cell phones, not households, because no one had power. Everyone was on their cell phones though. And we even chased and got new cell phone signups because T-Mobile was down. So everyone that had T-Mobile and Verizon could not get access to their cell service, only AT&T. So everyone started signing up for temporary AT&T plans. So we got all the new folks that signed up for temporary AT&T numbers, and we just dropped the text message to them. We didn't know what their registration was, but it was safe to assume, because it's the Panhandle and it's Bay County, it's safe to assume that 80% of your voters, 70% of your voters are Republicans. So you're more likely going to touch a Republican than not. So that's just, I guess, more detailed information on what we did than you probably needed. But it's good to know, like, these are different things you can do. I sometimes go down rabbit holes and talk about stuff. So yeah, back to those early vote rallies. Do it. It's actually another idea that we had that I tried to do in 2016 on the Rubio Senate race. I tried to organize a faith-based concert outside of a early vote location in Doral. We tried to put together this huge Christian concert, and we couldn't get the funding for it, but we were going to get Christian musicians and do this whole faith-based thing in a park that was across from the early voting location. And that was something that we tried to organize. We just couldn't get the funds for. It's going to happen this year, or next 2020. It's going to happen in 2020. I've been hyper fixating on this idea, and the faith-based engagement folks for the RNC, they do a wonderful job. They were all about this idea too, because it's just a different outside the box way of trying to turn out voters that don't typically get touched. And that's where a coalition program comes in for your larger field program. So that's just another idea is, to try to turn out voters. Some other early vote tactics, I touched on this, but I can't stress this enough. Tailor your GOTV calendar around what your voter contact, or tailor your voter contact universe around what your GOTV schedule looks like. I gave you guys a second handout. You guys should see, I think it was a memo I prepared for the Rubio Senate race. I don't know, how many pages did you guys get? Was it 3? Okay, good. Yeah, just read that. You don't have to read that right now. Read that later. But I wanted you guys to see, I prepared that memo as a look ahead to everyone on the campaign team in 2016. So I wanted you guys to be able to see what my mentality was and where my head was at during this race on building out what my GOTV calendar would look like. GOTV is Get Out the Vote. For those that don't know, I apologize. In Miami, also knowing your areas too is important, because Miami senior centers are a big thing. Senior centers are in Hialeah, senior centers in Little Havana. Those are a big thing for folks in the Hispanic community. And so we put together voter chase programs tailored to senior centers. We had people drive seniors back and forth from the senior centers to the voting location. We had absentee ballot sign-up drives at these senior centers. So these are other ideas that you can incorporate. Now, senior centers aren't a big thing around the rest of the country, but in some pockets, senior centers may be a thing. Miami, it's definitely a thing. I mean, there's roughly, I'd say, about 20,000 voters, 15 to 20,000 voters, that go to senior centers. And, it would be silly to not pay attention to them and treat them as important keys to winning your race. So that's just another example of how you could take advantage of early voting. We would use every single day that we had to drive people to go early vote. Yeah, one of the, I said it earlier, but one of the best things you could say on the doorstep is, the sooner you vote, the sooner we leave you alone. the less robocalls you'll get. I mean, seriously, I will purge, and this is something I don't think I mentioned yet. You want to get an update. If your state provides you the data, you need to update your voter file every single day to remove people who have already voted. You save money on mail pieces, so you remove them from getting mail if they've already voted. You remove them from your voter contact universe. You save money. Some vendors will hate that I'm saying this, but I approach things from the perspective of I need as much money as possible, and every dollar helps to turn out every little vote. And the more money I have to touch those that haven't voted, the more likely it is that increases the chances that I'm going to win a race. So you want to make sure that your mail vendors are removing people that have voted. Sometimes they're lazy and they won't do that. You want to make sure your phone vendors have the most up-to-date list of people who have voted. You want to make sure your digital folks have the up-to-date voter file, because you can target people digitally via the various data points that they have. Facebook does a match of the voter file to people that are on Facebook. Bet you didn't know that. Maybe you did if you went to the last session. I don't know if they talked about that, but you can match a voter file in Facebook to people that are on Facebook. And in Florida too, the other thing we also pay attention to is their language preference. We do Spanish mail pieces. We do Spanish digital. You got to do that. If you don't, it's silly. You have to match your mail pieces to how your voters interact and process their information. So that's just something that I want to throw out there too. Is don't think that you should send to everyone English pieces if unless you're in a state where it's all white people. But Miami, Florida, it's like we take everyone that is over 60 that are Hispanic, and we will send them a Spanish mail piece. That's generally how I do it, and I do it in Broward, Miami, and Orlando area, and Tampa. Hispanics everywhere else that are over 60, my assumption is if they're 60 but they're living in Fort Myers, odds are they're speaking English, because it's not a high concentration of Hispanic folks in that area. So that's the thought process there. I touched on this, doing a door-to-door piece with early voting locations on it. That's good. I've done that. Dropped off on their doorstep, says here's the early voting locations closest to you. I've even done it on election day, where I will deliver the mail piece that says this is your precinct. Just remember the example I gave you of if they change the precinct location last minute, you can get in trouble. The faith-based coalition is great for souls to the polls. The Democrats do that. It's always driven me nuts that the Republicans don't. I believe the faith-based, in my experience, I'm starting to see the faith-based community is actually starting to wake up to doing more political activity at churches. A lot of times pastors and folks are very much like, oh, no, I don't want to lose my nonprofit status, I don't want to get in trouble, but the Democrats have always gotten away with it. They will do souls to the polls, and frankly, it's stupid that Republicans don't. And we are actually doing a better job of organizing souls to the polls and trying to turn out voters there. The RNC has done a great job the past 2 election cycles in Florida in engaging the faith-based community. And I give them a lot of credit for tailoring a program to pursue and chase those folks. They've done a lot of voter registration at churches the past 4 years. So that is definitely a community that needs to be utilized, and you can use souls to the polls as an example for early voting turnout. During Hurricane Michael, this is another example of how we utilized churches for early voting. We actually did barbecues at churches on Sunday and had 5 mega churches. We touched about 6,000 people in one day at churches and pushed them to go early vote because pastors allowed us to set up a barbecue at churches, and we handed out information. That information was hurricane recovery information that had insurance information, kind of like the website I was telling you all about that we had, which was recovery information, and it also happened to have updated early voting hours and times. And some of those churches also happened to be early voting locations. So that was extra helpful. And so that's just another example of utilizing the faith-based community and souls to the polls to drive people to go vote. Oh, look, avoid distractions. yard signs, distraction. Remember, yard signs cannot vote, so you must go out and knock doors. And just a couple other little things for you guys to touch on for final GOTV. The most relevant thing you guys should be doing the final 3 days, 4 days of elections are door-to-door, phone banking, and having volunteers do text messaging. You don't want to have every single person do, the thing I will say on text messaging, you do not want to have the most random crazy person texting. You want to make sure your best staff, your adults, are going to be doing the text messaging, because what you don't want to have is that super excited, passionate volunteer, responding to people that say F you. You don't want them then saying, no, F you. And then like you have this eruption of angry text messages going back and forth, and then you become a press story. That has happened. Not to me, but I have seen an example of it being a news story in Florida where a local campaign sent back and forth text messages, and it was just bad. So avoid having a crazy person do your text messaging. That's just something to throw out there. And same with phone banking and door-to-door. You don't want your crazy person, and this happened to us 4 years ago in the 2016 election cycle. There was a super passionate Trump supporter that was going door to door, and they got cursed out, and there ended up being a fist fight at the door. And so, you want to make sure that you're very, very passionate people. I call them the crazies. I'm a crazy too, kind of. But you want to make sure that they're like not going to be going door to door and picking fights. So that's just something else to throw out there for field best practices. Okay, so yeah, handout 2 I already sent. I just talked about that. And this is something I just wanted to touch on for you guys. EDO, Election Day Operations, very, 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 very important to also have. I was yelling and screaming this last election cycle at everybody in Florida because I knew that we were going to end up in a recount. I was a total pain in the ass to everyone at the state party and the RNC because I kept saying, we need to get an EDO operation, we need to get an EDO operation up and running. And thank God we finally did. But what an EDO operation basically is Election Day Operations. That's your legal team, that's your poll watchers. That is, in case you go to a recount, you're able to immediately engage and start suing and calling out your bad supervisors, Broward, Palm Beach. You start calling them out for things that they're doing improperly, and that does happen. Shoot, Broward kept finding freaking boxes of ballots in cars. They found them at polling locations. Where did these ballots come from? No one freaking knows, and they still haven't explained it. That's why Palm Beach and Broward were removed. You had people in the supervisors of elections breaking machines so they couldn't tabulate votes, so they could miss a deadline, so new votes could not be counted. A person in Palm Beach jammed a paperclip into the machine so it would no longer work, so that ballots would not be counted, so that the updated ballots would not be part of the state total. This stuff, it's crazy, but it happens, and that's why you need to have a legal team to catch this type of stuff. We only found out about it because I had a lawyer at the location watching and observing all the activity that these fools were doing. So that's why it's important to have an EDO operation. Again, I don't want everyone to focus exclusively on this because everyone always likes to focus on the conspiracy theory shit. Don't, all right? It's important to have an Election Day operation, but not at the cost of an effective GOTV operation. Everyone always is like, oh my God, we need poll watchers. Everyone needs to be poll watching. You're not going to show up to a polling location with a red cape saving the day watching fraud. Generally, you're not going to do that. A better use of your volunteers is to have them out doing doors. But for the folks that aren't going to walk doors, encourage them to be poll watchers and save the day that way. But that's why it's important. In Florida, every vote matters. You have some people at polling locations do things improperly. They do not properly check IDs. They will let anyone go and vote. And that's why you need to prioritize your polling locations where you have poll watchers. And you're going to prioritize those locations based around, voting trends. And you're going to want to look at your highest areas of Republican votes. Make sure you have someone there so that poll watchers aren't doing things, discouraging voting. And then high Democrat turnout areas, you want to make sure that they're not just letting everybody go vote. And that sometimes does happen. So that's kind of a little bit of what I put together for you guys. I wanted to give everyone a little bit of everything, but with an emphasis on the early voting because it's so darn important. And really, Florida has led the country on how you do early voting. And we've been on the forefront on a lot of different things in Florida. Hispanic engagement, we have been on the front end. I give Jeb Bush a lot of credit because, the Jeb Bush that we saw in the presidential cycle wasn't the Jeb Bush that was our governor. The Jeb Bush that was our governor was a conservative champion. I mean, the guy was awesome. He helped to push Florida into the next place of having an updated voter file, of Hispanic engagement, everything that the GOP now talks about and does right, and in some instances better than the Democrats, is really because of Jeb Bush and the team that he had assembled in Florida in the late 90s and early 2000s. Florida, we call it the turn, but when Florida turned from blue to red was Jeb Bush, and all the preceding governors that came after him. Charlie Crist, whatever. We don't count that guy. But anyway, questions? Yes, ma'am. Yep. Yep. So the state of Florida is great in getting voter data. It's great on getting voter data because you just sign up and you're able to access it if you're a political organization, or you just have to do the sign up process for it, but it's a public record. Yep, you check the box. So when people sign up to register to vote, they check what their ethnicity is. So that is part of it. Some people don't check the box, and it falls into other, but that's when matching to other data sources helps. So there are data vendors that will take people's data and match it to, they'll match it to the voter file, and that's how you pick up on who's Hispanic. And that's also when you start playing in the different demos too, you have Puerto Ricans versus Cubans. And this was something that drove me nuts in 2012, watching how the Romney campaign did things. But like they thought that people were Hispanic, you just do a photo op with them and that's outreach. It's not. Puerto Ricans vote much differently than the Cubans. And thank God that we have now an influx of Venezuelans coming to Miami, because Venezuelans are angry and they hate socialism. And they're replacing a lot of the Cubans that have been dying off. A lot of the first generation Cubans, they're passing away. And so now the Venezuelans are repopulating our, conservative Hispanic, even the Colombians, even Puerto Ricans are starting to turn. We're starting to see it. I mean, the work that Senator Rubio has done in Florida, Governor Rick Scott, the work they've done within the Puerto Rican community has helped to move the needle. I mean, we won, I think, 45% of the Hispanic vote, which is incredible for the state of Florida. Republicans won 45% of the Hispanic vote, and that's because we talk to them. We communicate in their language. We talk about the issues that matter to them. So I keep going down tangents. I'm sorry. Yes. Last question? Last question? I don't know. Is that, well, yeah?
Last question.
Okay.
I'll let you have one more.
Okay, sure.
Are you familiar with Alliance Defending Freedom?
I'm sorry?
Alliance Defending Freedom? They will protect any church for free that gets sued by the IRS for the tax offense debt.
Oh, nice.
As far as certain churches in themselves, this would happen. Nobody's ever done it.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you guys very much. I appreciate y'all coming. I'll stick around a little bit if you have any questions. Thanks.